So welcome everyone. This is the first of a sequence of 3 open lectures organized by Jakobsleiter, an interdisciplinary peer-reviewed journal for high school students, which is published annually. And this has a theme in each year, and this year's theme is maps and models. And this week we are going to talk with Orsolya Bajer-Molnár, an evolutionary biologist. Next week we are going to talk to Ádám Nádasdy, a linguist and poet, and 2 weeks from now, our host or our guest speaker will be Csaba Plé, a psychologist and cognitive scientist. So the theme or the idea of Jakobsleiter is that we would like to create a platform for high school students to be able to publish their results, to be able to make their voices heard, and to be able to interact and engage with ongoing scholarly discussions and engage with scholars who are in their fields. And we thought that one of the ways of making people interested in this could be to bring the scholars to them. And the very first of these scholars is my guest today, Orsolya Bajer-Molnár, a former employee of Milestone and a very close colleague and friend of mine, and also at the present, a postdoctoral researcher at Konrad Lorenz Institut in Vienna, Austria, where she is working on science communication related to her own fields of expertise.
Hi, everybody.
Sorry. Yeah.
No.
Go on.
No, I was just going to say hi.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
I thought it was the perfect timing to say hi after these first 10 minutes. So. Yes,
absolutely. So in case you're interested in Jakobsleiter and what we are doing apart from today's lecture, you're more than welcome to visit our Facebook page, check out that, like us, follow us, and from the Facebook page you will find your way to our webpage where you will find further information about how Jakobsleiter is going to be published, what are the submission deadlines, what are the requirements for would-be authors, and what sort of other events we are organizing, because there will be a couple of other events organized during the summer to help young high school students to be able to put together a proper research article. With this, I'm going to switch on my interpreter mode and talk a little bit about the structure of today. So we have roughly 85 minutes today for this talk, which will be separated into 2 major parts. In the first, say, 30 to 40 minutes, we will be conducting a more formal interview in which I'm going to ask questions and sort of directing Orsi to bring up a number of interesting topics related to maps and models and how this year's theme could be translated into her topics of interest. And the idea with this is that probably some of you might get a good idea here, or you might get an idea developed here that you can later on work with to put together a paper. And after that, we are going to turn to a discussion where I'm very much encouraging everyone who is present to raise their own questions, to bring up their own topics, and to engage with Orsi, who is very kindly offered to be here for all our questions. So in case you have any questions in the meantime, please write it up or just remind yourself that you will have a question at the end, and then you come forth and there will be an open sort of platform for all the questions that you might have. So with this, if that's all right with you, Orsi, I would jump right into the conversation, and I would like to start with looking a little bit at how you ended up where you are. And I don't specifically mean the research institute in which you're working, although you're welcome to talk about that as well. But more interestingly, if I look at your biography, I see a variety of topics. I see that you started with evolutionary biology, and then was at one point there was thinking about ecosystems, and now you are fairly and squarely, if I may say that, in science communication. And I'm wondering, how would you characterize this journey of yours?
I mean, probably as a journey. That's probably the best way I can describe it. So I started out working on evolutionary biology as in fundamental research. And the very pragmatic reason to that was just because I was interested in it. And I had a bunch of questions and no one wanted answers. So I started studying evolutionary biology. I started doing research in evolutionary biology. And that, the way I guess a research evolves, if I use this very cliche word for it, is every time you think you have an answer to the question you had previously, it drags with it a bunch of new questions. So that's going to kind of lay out the direction of your next steps and then your future, pathways and whatnot. So anyway, I started evolutionary biology, I started behavior ecology, and then with behavior ecology, I was into sexual selection and sexual signals. And then one of the things that is often represented in sexual signals is parasite load and health state. So that took me to parasite evolution, because then I got interested in what parasites were doing with their hosts. And then that took me to Brazil, not because there was a postdoc in Brazil that I was able to collaborate on. And then in Brazil, while I was researching parasites, it was in 2014 to 16, there was an outbreak of the Zika virus, which probably a lot of us have heard of. And the outbreak started in the city that I was living in. So I had a lot of firsthand experience from doctors and patients and whatnot, but everybody knew that virus was there decades back. And I actually had a doctor say to me the year before that if I had to choose from the epidemics that are currently in that city of dengue and yellow fever and Zika, I should hope to be infected with Zika, because that's just like 2 days of fever and then you're done. And then it turned out that that wasn't the case in the 2015 outbreak. So there were like a bunch of, premature babies born, microcephalic babies born. And, that was really kind of a question that I had to ask from the perspective of parasite evolution, like, what is going on? What happened? Like, how did this happen? And anyway, that took me into the emerging infectious disease. And so with emerging infectious diseases, I was still very much in the fundamental research, right? So I was doing, the evolution and the host parasite assemblages and like how parasites react with their hosts and And, but at one point, my research got to a stage where I realized that evolutionary biology knows something about how diseases work that it's as if it's not being acknowledged in fields that battle diseases and combat diseases. And so that is where I had this, and I'm still in this ginormous shift of a discipline where I go from the fundamental research of, the typical scientist locked in their office running models, and then something comes out that nobody understands, to science policy, which is what I'm doing now. Which means, how do you build channels and how do you go from science saying this is what we should do to actually getting it done? Because that getting it done alone is probably just as big of a science as the previous one of what should we do. And so now I'm on the interface of these two, coming from fundamental research, bringing all of my baggage, positive and negative, from fundamental research to this very pragmatic, very practical, very dynamically changing field of policy on how do we work with legislations, how do we work with laws, how do we work with people, how do we implement anything in communities that are rural communities and are farming, and like, how do we take science to the people? And then science communication, of course, it's a part of it, which is, also, I'm not going to say that's why I got involved in it. I got involved in it because I love to talk, and that's just like an opportunity for anyone to talk about science. But I think it's crucial in building these bridges. Wonderful.
What I noticed while you were talking is that you're referring to a number of events that shaped your journey, sort of random things that just happened. What I'm also wondering, because in many a scientist's journey from one field to the other, there are also influential figures, people who sort of made an effect on how you are thinking, on what you are thinking, what you're interested in. So did you have such influences, or was it really only these random events, as it might have seen from what you have said so far?
I mean, you know, of course there were influential figures. I honestly, I categorize meeting influential figures as events. You know, so one of my key collaborators, Daniel Brooks, who I've been working with on the protocol on how to prevent emerging infectious diseases. I mean, he had as big of an influence on me as the Zika did, right? So meeting him was quite an event. So in terms of, I'm just going to say contemporary figures, so the people I've actually managed to physically interact with, I've definitely had some who I still work with, and then also some whose talks and presentations I just listened to. And it just, you know, made something click and made me have, you know, an idea, a direction that will then define my upcoming, you know, take on a situation. But then I also think that there were historical figures, and not only because of what they figured in science, but because I always bring up this example. So everybody thinks I'm in love with Charles Darwin because I'm an evolutionary biologist, and I, you know, don't get me wrong, he's a great guy. But then one of the people that I think is just out there is Mendel, the geneticist. And of course, I mean, you know, we all probably know how he is just way ahead of his time in figuring out how genes work and what was going on with inheritance. Well, not genes, because he didn't know about genes, but he figured out inheritance, and he was able to foresee that one day in the future, people are going to find something that behaves exactly like this. But that's one thing, right? So that's genetics. But what I think is remarkable about him is that he grew up, was socialized, and worked in an environment where the science was extremely entangled with religion. It was very authoritative, right? There was a central declaration of how the world functioned, and that was it. And I think that for someone to be able to step out of their social context as much as he did and put nothing but a scientific experiment in the middle of everything, and be able to say that, you know, everything I was brought up in, everything I know, I mean, he was a monk, everything I served, I really appreciate you guys and I really respect you guys, but I just think we're wrong. And this is what I think is going on over here. I think that is as much of a genius as figuring out inheritance. And I think that has nothing to do with natural sciences. It has everything to do with what type of a person someone is. So he is probably one of, you know, aspiring to be, I don't know, 10% like Mendel. I'd be happy with that.
Yes, I think everybody who is in related to science at any point in his or her life would like to have this moment when you find out something fundamental that would shift an entire discipline or our perspective, or bring about a so-called paradigm shift in a given field. And you have already been talking about this a bit, how there is a shift that you are perceiving now. And what I'm curious about still on this topic of influential figures and how science is being represented and how it affected you, I think from among a number of natural sciences that are represented to some extent in public parlance, is evolutionary biology is a special one. It has one of its apostles for a long time. And I'm of course referring to Richard Dawkins, who has been on talk shows and on various book covers and basically everywhere. And I know that there are a lot of criticism about his person and what he is saying and how he is saying it. So I'm just wondering if you see and where you see a specific difference between your journey through fundamental research into becoming related to public science, and where he is, or people similar to his sort of position are?
So I think, don't get me wrong, all credit's given to Dawkins on his work. But I think that one of the key differences that I am trying to implement in my own work is I'm trying to not use science to prove other people's beliefs wrong, if that would be a single sentence to summarize it. I'm trying to not use facts to prove something that those facts can't prove.
Mm-hmm.
And so in this case, what I mean is, we know a lot of things about the DNA. We know how the DNA mutates. We know what evolution looks like, more or less, right? But that alone has nothing to do with the ability of proving or disproving any type of deity in existence,
mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? There is no connection between the two. And I think this is where, and it's, it's not all on Dawkins. I mean, this is a very typical trend in science, and not only in natural sciences, in many different sciences, is, the fact that we are smart in a topic that we do a lot of research on, which makes it not so difficult to be smart in that. We tend to kind of generalize us being smart, as in, so whatever I say is right, right? And this is, I think that finding good results in science is probably a little easier than understanding the limitations of science.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think this is something that I don't know if I'm doing it right, but I'm anyway trying to keep this in mind, because what my work involves is bringing together fields that have very little to do with each other in terms of characteristics.
Mm-hmm.
So if you need to do A and blue in fundamental research, then you need to do Z and red in policy,
mm-hmm.
which is why a lot of times these two don't meet,
mm-hmm.
right? So for instance, fundamental research likes to think in timescales such as 10 years, 20 years, 2050, what's climate change going to do our future generations? Policy thinks in months,
mm-hmm.
in this end of this year when the budget ends, in the next 3 years when the elected official is going to run out of its mandate. Those are the timescales they're thinking of.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think if someone wants to create something interdisciplinary between two fields, then you can't go in there kicking the door down from either of the directions.
Mm-hmm.
You can't go in there saying, I'm right, you guys need to do as I say, right? You need to understand where the other person is coming from, what their values are, what their concerns are, what their constraints are, because that's the only way you two can work together.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So,
just to comment at this point, I see that members of the audience already started posting questions in the chat. That's wonderful. We will come to the second part of the lecture where all the questions posted by the audience will be brought in, or I would even say members of the audience are welcome to just unmute themselves and ask their questions, but we'll come back to that. But I just want to follow up on one thing that you said at this point, Orsi, or basically what you didn't say yet, and I would like to push you on that. You said what a scientist shouldn't do, or scientists shouldn't be doing, but if you were to say in one sentence, or in two sentences if you wish, what scientists should be doing, what would it be?
One sentence, if I had to summarize everything, I would say that a scientist needs to stay open and needs to stay doubtful on their work, on their results, on other fields, other issues, other questions. I think this is one of the issues that I know I'd been facing, is that your passion, your curiosity, your interest, it sucks you in to your own research, to the niche, to that manuscript, that statistic, that figure that you're working on. And you lose sight of the outside world. There was a very interesting workshop that I had done just this year, and I think it's super representative. So they asked a bunch of us to describe a hypothetical ideal office that we would like to work in, an office space. And of the 15 people over there, all scientists from completely different disciplines, economics, anthropology, biology, science philosophy, you name it, 99% of us described the office as either being on top of a very high building with a long staircase leading up to it, having closed windows or no windows. And I think that is absolutely representative. That is what, and it, it's a normal human reaction to be preoccupied with what you're doing, but we can't lose sight of the outside world. We need to stay in context, stay current, stay relevant, right? We can't detach ourselves just because we're doing science.
Yes, I absolutely, I fully agree with you. This is precisely the idea behind Jakobsleiter, that we create this ladder through which is not only the students can climb up and interact with scholars, but scholars can climb down as the angels were coming down in the biblical narrative of Jacob's ladder, and interact with students who are just the ones who are just coming up, or the ones who are just climbing the ladder. Great. It was a very, I think, a very heartwarming way of how you described the job of scientist. And with this, I would like to jump into hardcore scientific questions, as it were, or the way I would phrase them. But I would still like to start with something more relatable. And I would like to start with evolutionary biology or genetics, as it were. And perhaps a way in which it features recently in the life of many of us. I repeatedly come across interesting advertisements which invite me to participate in DNA testings and have my DNA tested and have my ancestry told to me. And I often have a view that it is something of a sham, that they're trying to pull me off for some money. And I'm wondering, coming from the scholarly background that you are coming from, do you see any use of such things, or is it just a newfold Ponzi scheme to, or whatever scheme to pull off people?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of it being a scam, I think, I've seen more dangerous scams than this, because it doesn't, promise anything that it won't deliver later on. I mean, you get to decide, you get what you pay for, right? You get a paper that you're 10% Viking and 5% Mongolian, whatever, and you're related to Genghis Khan with 0.3%, right? So it's like that type of, researching our origins, really. So I think the scam, or like the sham or conspiracy part that I've heard related to this is that they're all collecting our DNA in a big brother data bank somewhere, and then one day something's going to happen from people, gaining access to our DNA, whatever sequences. As a natural scientist, I think that is well along the lines of science fiction as of today and to the end of our lives. So it's not, they can't mind control you, and they can't, remotely do something to you just because they have access to your DNA. In terms of it being useful, though, there are studies where sometimes you can read these fun facts of, humanity is descended of 6 males, originating, I don't know, a couple tens of thousands of years ago in wherever. Or that, the large migration routes of Mongols went all the way to . So like these studies oftentimes are based on these types of genetic analyses, where if you get enough people to submit their DNA to a database, and then you can analyze those sequences with as much detail as you have, then you can actually discover these large patterns of, hey, there is remarkably high percent of whatever origin in this population, or hey, there is like a spike of whatever type of DNA in coming from those samples over there. And I think the reason this is important today is because we need to remember that 150 years ago, there were probably, 5% of the population who's ever been abroad. Whereas today, that would probably be more 60% of the population. So the world is changing into such an interconnected, globalized, international community that these patterns within generations are going to be, diluted. Because, until 150 years ago, people tended to marry with those they knew who were in the very close vicinity of where they lived, where they were born, where they kind of stayed along their lives. But today, this has all changed and everybody can go anywhere. So I think this is one of the reasons that these are important, because those scientists working with these relationships realize that it will be, disappearing in a matter of a couple of generations, or diluting anyway. And then if we want to talk about, a completely different perspective over here, when you think about, DNA analysis, right? And then analyses such as paternal analyses. So the part, everybody thinks that DNA has always been a fundamental research natural science, but in fact, paternity tests and DNA samples were at one point predominantly improving because of criminology. Because criminology needed to find a way to identify someone based on their DNA samples. And if any of you watch crime shows, then you know that any crime scene 20 or 30 years ago, they were collecting blood samples because all they could tell was the blood group, right? The A0, B0, AB, whatever. But that wasn't enough. And so criminology was actually hugely responsible and had a huge credit in figuring out how to analyze human DNA and how to identify someone based on human DNA. And I know that there are ethical concerns raised, but when it comes to perpetrators who can only be caught based on their human DNA, or based on their DNA, hopefully it's human, right? But based on their DNA, then these large data banks can also be of assistance to a department or discipline that has nothing to do with fundamental science, to police forces and armed forces and law.
Mm-hmm. There is another sort of implicit hope there as well, isn't there, of finding out ways of curing incurable diseases, of mapping out the variety or the diversity of human genes and finding sort of patterns in it. And this brings me to another sort of, I think, very general question that is often asked in relation to genetics or the DNA analysis, is whether there are really like good type of genes that would help you come across these difficulties or avoid the unavoidable diseases that are awaiting people at the end of their lives, or sometimes earlier than that.
I mean, so there definitely is, right? So there is, on the one hand, now we have things like personalized cancer therapy, where they take a sample of that particular tumor that you have and then analyze which factors are responsible for the growth. And then they fine-tune therapy for targeting your particular, malicious tumor, which is obviously, those are our key contributions. There is also ways of now screening people who have a genetic, well, you can say predisposition or tendency or history in the family of developing type 2 diabetes, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, this, that. I do, however, need to emphasize here that oftentimes the role the genes play in especially, elderly life diseases is very over exaggerated. They tend to make it like a lot of times it seems like it's the genes, right? So, and I think over here it's also very important to point out that this is a narrative that is so widespread because it has a huge psychological factor in it. Because the psychology behind it of, oh, okay, so they developed cancer because they had bad genes. I don't, so I'm fine, right? They developed type 2 diabetes because their genes were bad. They developed, it's like when we say, oh, you're so skinny because you have good genes and I have bad genes. That's why I'm bigger. And this way I don't need to deal with the fact of, don't I eat a lot, right? So there is a huge part, and in these types of diseases, it turns out that the major part is played by the environmental factors. The environments either that we are put in or we are born in, but also the environments that we create for ourselves, the resources that we choose to use. I mean, this has been out there from forever of how type 2 diabetes is related to lifestyle, how Alzheimer can be made worse by particular, impacts, particular stimuli. So a lot of this is what we call the epigenetics, which is whatever is in my gene is what I can potentially express. But then what I express of those is largely defined by what type of stimuli I am getting, right? I may have a genetic predisposition for being overweight, but if I don't eat more than 1,800 calories a day, it's physically impossible for me to become overweight unless I am completely sessile, like a sponge in the sea, right? So there are these factors there.
Yes, very clearly. We have been talking with regards to the role of genes. We have been talking about non-infectious diseases, or you have been talking about things like cancer, diabetes, overweight, cardiovascular diseases, and the rest. But there is another field of diseases that we are coming across, and especially nowadays, we are very much aware of the fact that there are viruses, there are bacteria out there, which can cause infection even if people are trying to live or actually making it certain that they are very much taking care of their healthy lifestyles, whatever it might mean. And I'm wondering, when it comes to your expertise in evolutionary biology, perhaps in epidemiology, how do you see the role of a scholar in the communication about these diseases or such diseases that are infectious?
So I think, and this is something that I have some experience in, because ever since we're in a pandemic, suddenly everybody was interested in, viral evolution, which I happen to be working on. So like there were a lot of questions. And I find it that it's very difficult. It's surprisingly difficult. Because on the one hand, you have very good tools and you have very good practices on how you can communicate to the public on how diseases work and how evolution works with diseases, and very simple responses to when will COVID be over, to which, the answer is never. But, these things never go away. When is the flu going to be over? When is herpes going to be over? When is HIV going to be over? Those things have been, we've been battling those for decades, and they're fine.
But polio is over, isn't it?
Polio?
Yeah.
So there's just a recent outbreak this year. And interestingly enough, so like, see, so let me give you an example, right? So I'll take polio as an example because I think it's very, so polio works with a vaccine. The vaccine is what we call an attenuated vaccine, which means that there is a living but kind of weakened virus in the vaccine. And the theory behind that is that we inject the weakened virus into the system, which is for, you know, longest time unable to reproduce as a normal virus would be, so it cannot cause disease, and thus provides ample opportunity for the immune system to combat it. Mm-hmm. And it's worked fine. I mean, there's no polio disease in Hungary, there's no polio disease in Germany since we've introduced the Sabin vaccines and the Sabin whatever. But the outbreak of polio now is in Central Africa. Mm-hmm. And the strain of virus that is causing the outbreak is called vaccine-derived polio. And what happens there is that, polio vaccines have been distributed as charity to rural communities way below global poverty, to people who have no access to fresh water, to basic hygienic standards. I mean, people in need. And there was this charity, series of charity events where they were giving out polio vaccines to stop the polio epidemic. The problem was that the theory of the polio vaccine and every attenuated vaccine, which works fine in Western communities, is that the child you give it to has a healthy immune system in that they're well fed, they are hydrated, they live in a clean, sanitary environment. And this turns out not to be true for people living below the global poverty line. Mm-hmm. And what happens in those cases is that the immune system is not well equipped and it's not able to battle the polio virus, even if it's attenuated. And during the opportunity provided, it cannot combat the disease. So the virus does start reproducing and it causes a disease. So the outbreaks, the initial outbreaks, were triggered by polio vaccinations. Mm-hmm. It was those people who got the vaccines that got sick. So this is, I think, a very good example in the issues of science communication. I hope I was able to tell you the story, reasonably clearly and concisely for everybody to understand what happened. But then what happens if now you have a question, having heard this from, an evolutionary biologist, oh, so should I not vaccinate myself? Should I? Okay, so attenuated vaccines, is that what we have with the COVID? Are we going to get COVID from the vaccine? Right? So yeah. It's incredibly slippery, right? And I think this is a huge, it's a landslide we need to be very, very careful with, because if you get the right data, the right results with the wrong context out to an audience, it's going to deliver the absolute opposite that you want, mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. right? So the reality is that polio vaccines work because they have eradicated the disease in communities that were prepared for that type of vaccination. Mm-hmm. But before, vaccines are not magic. Science is not magic. Science has incredible opportunities, incredible results and potential, but it has its limitations, right? And we can't forget about those. And this is true for everything. So vaccines are wonderful if they're used the right way, if they're used with thought put into who I'm giving it to, why I'm giving it to, when I'm giving it to them, which is what you see with the COVID vaccines, where you have all this, questionnaire to fill out. If you are pregnant, if you are breastfeeding, if you have a chronic disease, then you get that type of vaccine. If you are this age group, you get that type of vaccine. If you have kids, you get this. If you work in whatever environment you work, you get that. So this is the type of thought, right, that is put in there because good science learns from previous mistakes.
Mm-hmm. Just one more question before we open the floor for the public to ask their questions. It's just one sort of follow up on this, and perhaps bringing us closer to the theme of maps and models, is that one element of public science that I have been seeing a lot ever since the beginning of the COVID virus, but actually even before that, with regards to other infectious diseases, are these very beautiful, colorful images of how the virus is working, or how the virus looks like in a 3-dimensional, 2-dimensional space. And so I'm wondering, what is the use of those? Is there any use to those, or are they just nice pictures?
I mean, they're very, very useful. I think that the question here is, how are they useful? So when it comes to virologists or vaccine development groups, right? Nobody has a printout of the SARS-CoV-2 and looks at it to develop a vaccine. So those images are not helpful in that, how do I fit this antibody to that little red spike, right? But it is very useful when you talk about visualization. When you talk about, and I think this is a key part in any vaccination program, because I think vaccination is a very good example on how science is delivered to the people. So it's one thing to develop vaccines. It's one thing to make them available via, vaccine manufacturing and infrastructures and one thing. But what a lot of times when, fundamental researcher people like me, they do the research, they forget that if you put all these things in an equation, like you research the virus, you identify it, you develop the vaccine, you make it, transferable and stable, then they forget that the vaccine uptake in the equation is not a constant, right? It's not permanent. You need to get people to want that vaccine and to trust that vaccine and to voluntarily say, okay, I will have myself vaccinated. Because if you don't, then you're going to be there with trucks and trucks and truckloads of vaccines, and no one's going to be interested in it, right? And so I think when you talk about, tools like visualization on showing the lay audience what it is that we're combating here, because, and I think from my perspective, in my family, I have people who are, 70 and above. And they really have a difficult time understanding, because the regulations introduced in COVID are somewhat similar to the regulations they've had in military situations, in, the 56 revolution. And now they're having the same, restrictions, but they don't see the enemy, right? And it tones down the threat in their mind. It's, I don't see it. I saw my neighbor, he's fine. I saw the lady in the supermarket, she looked fine. I saw a woman with her kid outside, they looked fine. Is there a threat, actually, right? And this is where I think things like science communication, pictures, animated graphs, infographics, things come in which show anybody who is willing to look at it or listen to it that, hey, this is the situation, and I understand you don't see it, as in, there's no viruses walking up and down the street with a revolver, right? But it's a threat just like a military situation would be, because it's not everyone, but it could be anyone, right? And I think this is where these types of tools come in. So in terms of combating the virus, a well-designed animation is nothing less impactful and important than a well-designed research is.
Okay, wonderful. I would have multiple questions yet, but at this point, as I promised, I would really much like the audience to come in and ask their questions. There have been a couple of questions already put in the chat window, but I would like to encourage all of you who are here to actually unmute yourself and and ask your questions with your own words, so that we can create a discussion out of an interview. So at this point, I would like to just ask you to unmute yourself and ask your questions. I'm sure there are questions out there, but apparently until people gather their thought, oh yeah.
Yes, so perhaps and I just feel that and of course it perhaps is natural, but on the other hand, this pushes the the pro-science communication towards a bit of the extreme. So in the simplified message, one may feel that the role of science is very much not necessarily exaggerated, but sometimes it still feels like as if as you know, okay, let's just keep this posting to the scientists, and the scientists will just take care of this somehow. So what do you think would be like the optimal state? And of course, not necessarily in such a pandemic situation, but in a kind of everyday. So what would be the optimal way of communicating science towards the public? So what would be the best form to have like that kind of trust in the public, but at the same time not to make them overestimate, so to speak, the capabilities, or for them also to appreciate the limitations of science. I hope the question was understandable.
Yeah, I think I get it. So I think one of this was just actually a talk that we had yesterday within the Institute. And I think it really made a good point. So when you think about issues that we deal with in our everyday lives, there is this, it's a philosophical thought line that differentiates what we call matter of facts. Like, you can measure gravity, that's a matter of fact. You can measure speed or acceleration anyway, that's a matter of fact. And then matter of concern, which, am I going to reach the bus? Am I doing my work right? Does my significant other trust me or love me enough, right? They're non-factual matters, but nevertheless, they are just as important in our lives as the matters of facts are. And so I think one of the well, you can say like the reasons of potential distrust in science is that we scientists were trained and we're used to dealing with matters of facts. You need to measure it, you need to run the statistics, you need to get numbers, and you need to tell me if that is plausible, probable, or definitely, certain. So we deal with things we can touch, things we can see, things we can measure. And I think that in many cases, science has a difficult time stepping out of dealing with matters of facts and dealing with matters of concerns. And then when you talk to people in policy, for instance, so I'm just going to give you an example of what it was kind of a revelation for me. So we put together the DAMA protocol and we submitted it to like a very high authority, like a government agency. And as a scientist, you have the numbers telling you on how long this plan can, last, and how it can inhibit diseases, and like, in 20 years time, if you measure the number of emergences here, then you're supposed to see a lot less. So that's the matter of fact, right? And then we submitted it to someone, or beforehand, there was someone who took a look at it, and he said, well, you guys do understand that whoever is going to be looking at this has a mandate of 4 years. So whatever they're going to be interested in has to happen in 3, because after the 3rd year, it's re-election. And that's their matter of concern, right? And from their perspective, you need to understand that for someone who's that's their profession and that's their job, they can't prioritize your 50-year vision, because they probably won't even be around in 50 years. I mean, their kids might be, but for now, their concern is, what do I do when my mandate is over? Am I going to be here? Am I going to be kicked out? Is it going to be a completely different team? How does this proposal serve my concerns? And I think this is where science communication often goes down a different path. So we present our facts, they clash with someone's concern, and the way we try to address their concern is by hammering them with more facts, right? So if you say conspiracy theory, right, or anti-vaccine people, so you need to figure out that the root cause over here is not people having read the research of vaccination and statistically have found that vaccines have a higher percentage of not working. The root cause of any conspiracy theory is ideology. They simply have a different belief system, politics. There is a very interesting distribution among social layers in conspiracy theories, and looking at which social layers are more prone to having and being engaged in conspiracy theories. So there is a social pressure and a social environment, right? And these are all factors that I'm not going to be able to address by just, flailing papers of vaccine research. And I think this is what science communication needs to understand. It needs to be an educated communication. I need to know my audience. I need to know who I'm talking to. And I need to talk to them. And I can't lecture them. I can't call them out. No one's ever stopped being a conspiracy theorist just because someone told them they're dumb. That's never happened. Or, no one's been called an idiot by a professor emeritus and then changed their mind of, oh, I'm going to believe in that. That's never happened. So I need to start speaking that type of a language that my audience uses. And that's how I can get a message home. And I think this is what science communication is about.
Thank you very much for the answer. Yeah. It's very, very insightful.
The floor is open for further questions. Then until further questions are brought in, I will just read out one of those that were posted in the chat before. At one point at the very beginning of the lecture, you said that you don't want to use science to question the beliefs of others. And the question is whether it's really a choice and whether you think that young Earth creationism is compatible with modern Darwinism.
When we say compatible, if we ask whether it's, if by compatible we mean, are they two equal competing sides or opposing sides? I don't think so. If we ask, are they equally important in shaping opinion, whether it's individual opinion or public opinion, I think they are compatible. And then this is a struggle I've been experiencing from multiple different sides in terms of creationism or evolution. And this is really my take. So don't look at it as, the general, universal truth of anything. But I personally, I don't like to engage in this debate on creationism or evolution. And I don't like scientists engaging in this debate, and I don't like creationists engaging in this debate, because to me, and again, but to me, this is a debate asking, do you like orange juice or pizza? It's not the same thing, you know, it's just not. And this is why you're never going to reach a consensus, because the one of them is a belief system of how Earth is created. But I think more importantly, most of the belief systems are in one way or another looking for the meaning of life. We want to know why we're here. We want to know who put us here. We want to know what is the meaning, what is the aim of all of this? Is it for me to go to heaven? Is it for me to go to nirvana? Is it for me to go to Valhalla? What do I need to be afraid of? Do I need to be afraid of hell? Do I need to be afraid of, what is it? And, science can't give you the answer to that. Never will be able. Science doesn't know what the meaning of life is. It just doesn't. And for now, it doesn't have the tools to tell you and to investigate nirvana or the existence of nirvana, right? So this is why I don't think this is a valid couple to put in a relationship of debate, because it's just not the same thing, right? And then I always use this type of argument, and then I know it makes me, seem like, oh, okay, she's one of those. But so 200 years ago, if you went out there and told someone that, hey, I think there are these spiral-like double chains of molecules inside our body, which is actually not even a single body, but billions and billions of tiny little bubbles stuck together in a body shape. I mean, the best option you would have had is that they would laugh at you. The worst is they would burn you, right? Because we and nobody had the means of checking if that was true, because we didn't have microscopes, we didn't have biochemistry, we didn't have a lot of these tools, right? Now, fast forward 200 years, now we know that the DNA is there, and now we know that the cells are there because we can see them, we can, I don't know, make all these, preparations, we can visualize them, we can look into a microscope and whatnot. But just because we see something we didn't see 200 years ago does not mean we see everything. And by this, I mean, are there ghosts? I don't know. But I can't tell you, I can't prove if there are, and I can't prove if there aren't, because we don't have the measuring equipment. We don't have something that's going to tell you, look, this is a cell. I managed to isolate it. Maybe, 200 years ago, or 200 years later, or 2 years later, or tomorrow, someone's going to design something that says, hey, I caught a ghost. Here it is. I captured a spirit. I captured whatever. I recorded a phenomenon that we think is supernatural. But 2,000 years ago, we thought a volcano was supernatural, right? We call things supernatural that we don't understand, but it's because of our limitations, right? And then creationism and belief systems are arguing about something that we can't yet check and prove, and science is working with things we already see. And they're trying to prove each other wrong. One of them talking about heavens above us, and the other one talking about cells under a microscope.
But then it's not their aim that is different. It's the scope or the level on which they interact with evidence.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, both of them. I mean, creationism uses footages of exorcisms and stuff like that. I don't know, EVPs and recordings of, ghosts and case studies where it was potential reincarnation, that someone, 6-year-old child spoke a language that nobody spoke. I mean, that type of stuff, right? I mean, you see these in like a lot of these arguments when they're not philosophical and theological. But again, I mean, it's two completely different scales, different scopes, different parts of human life, right? It's a beverage and a food. You don't drink, you don't choose. You drink and you eat, right?
Absolutely. Further questions from the audience?
May I go ahead?
Sure, please.
So it was very interesting that you talked about science communication. I'm currently taking a module that is studying pseudosciences and propaganda. And we watched a documentary about flat earth believers, a society of them. And they said that they do not mistrust science itself, but scientific institutions. So they believe that there's a huge conspiracy with all teachers and scientists involved. And how do you think the scientific society should react to this?
I think this is an excellent point. And I think it's super relevant. And I think it really points to the real issues when we talk about pseudoscience, when we talk about, mistrust in science, that science often, for various different reasons, because it's hierarchical, because it's authoritative, because most of the science projects are funded by public agencies, as in the government, right? It becomes a symbol of the system, whatever that may be. And it's a symbol that people tend to treat as such, right? That people will treat as the coat of arms or the daughter cell of the system. And so they exhibit the feelings they have towards the system, towards science. And science offers a variety of different topics that you can get a grasp on and say, my feelings towards this big brother that I picture it to be are negative and are rejective. And so there is this fundamental claim that they say, Newtonian physics, or Earth is round, or vaccines work. And I'm going to go against that. I'm going to take it to the heart, and I'm going to, hurt them where it hurts the most. And this is how a lot of these movements develop. It has very little actually to do with science. It has a lot to do with rejecting, the government, with rejecting the social structure they live in, with rejecting the social equalities that they're experiencing, and looking for symbols to do so. Because, very few people are willing to just grab weapons and attack the whatever government buildings. So I am going to be member of the educated resistance over here, or I'm going to, the whatever resistance, and I'm going to just join one of these resistances. And so there was a very interesting study that one of my hopeful collaborators did on vaccine hesitancy here in Austria. And so their findings were that vaccine hesitancy, of all the different factors of educated, school, that most remarkably and most significantly defined whether someone was willing to take the vaccine or not was whether they voted for the current government or they didn't. Because those who voted against the current government were strikingly the most among whom you would find the vaccine resistant ones. And so this is just, again, to prove a point. So, this is an issue that scientists are trying to combat with showing more science, but the issue is not the science. The issue is something that is not out on the table. But until that is addressed, I mean, science can, you know, spin around on their head. It's not going to be targeted. And I think, so if I want to like give a concise answer to your question is, I think, I mean, I hate to repeat myself, but I think science needs to realize when it's not their jurisdiction, when they can't do anything. You know, I mean, I can't, it's going to be very difficult for me to convince someone about my facts who hates me because they hate my boss. And if I don't realize that, I'm going to be in this constant, permanent, fruitless debate because I'm not addressing the real reasons.
Further questions? Now is the time. Then I will read in one more of those that were asked in the chat. You said at one point when I asked you to summarize to us what science is about, is that science is about openness, remaining doubtful, and sort of maintaining this critical attitude toward everything that we encounter. And the question is whether you can do any scientific endeavor without a strong belief in science, and whether you can drive policy-oriented projects without a firm belief in some basic scientific knowledge.
I think it's a good question. If you say, you know, basic science, I think that is something very difficult to define, because you would say, you know, basic science is gravity. But even there, I mean, I'm not a physicist, but I'm, you know, a physicist would say, well, where? You know, I mean, gravity is not always as we imagined it. Like, where are we talking? So, like, you know, basic science, I think, is a very, very difficult bubble to define the limits of. I think when it comes to policy, it is not doubting everything. You know, it's not this LARP with doubt that whatever I'm doing, I just need to doubt everything. But I also think it's not about trusting anything that science produces. And I think more importantly, it's not about taking scientific results as universal truths. I think that's most important. And again, I need to go back to the limitations. So well-designed scientific research and their results is going to be significant. But we need to understand that the significance has a context in which it is significant, and it has an expiration date. Because good science is the one that is able to correct itself. So we need to let go of, when we say we want to leave a permanent mark on this earth, we need to let go of the idea that it's going to be one of our scientific results. Mm-hmm. It is going to be, if anything, it's going to be the progress and really the journey that we go through. It is going to be the way we are able to shift contexts, shift from one thing we thought was the truth to the other thing that turned out to be the next truth, and the next truth in line, right? So it is our ability to undergo this change and adapt and really rock this change that is the constant characteristic of science. So I think it really is, it's not a fact you need to trust, it's the process that you need to trust, right? And for the policy anyway. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right?
All right, that was a little bit of a break for those members of the audience who I'm certain have questions, to phrase their questions precisely, so that now they can speak up. Yeah, go on, Shimon.
Okay, thank you. So basically, my question will still be connected to this issue of just like science and the public, and perhaps some and also it just got me thinking this this debate between Darwinism, or this debate or non-debate between Darwinism and creationism. So on the one hand, I just found this characterization very good. This kind of similarly with this food and beverage. So that these would be two different things. But I feel that, for instance, in the case of creationism and Darwinism, we just come to, I feel that it just come to a point where I can't help but see that it is to some point science and religion standing in a more or less open dichotomy, or in a more or less open opposition, basically, because of course perhaps it's not directly about science, perhaps it's also at some point about beliefs in heaven, for instance, but still so like I just really can't help but say that if science is saying that we are really just one point in the universe, and we weren't created, but we evolved through time, or humanity as such did not exist from the beginnings of time. So this just kind of like undermines one very basic foundation of the other system. So I just still feel that we just can't completely disconnect these two parts from each other. So I just still feel that there is kind of a connection between them, and perhaps it's not really about science, but still, if we look at on a perhaps philosophical level, or in a more theoretical level, that there is still a big tension that is perhaps prone to cause conflicts, or is it?
No, I think I get the point that you're touching on. And interestingly enough, so I mean, I guess it's not that surprising, but this is the point where science tends to lose its battles against creationism. It's when the debate comes to, we are here, these randomly self-organizing molecules who just so happen to spit out something that looks like me. And, as soon as we take our last breath, we're just going to decay underneath a bunch of bouquets, and that's going to be it. And it will have had no meaning, because we're just like randomly mutating molecules in the, in the landscape of eternity, right? And this is where science loses, because I think it's very important, and I really have to go back to the context. So when whatever debate you're entering into, you're debating with people, and you're talking to people, and a person, whether they're right or wrong, typically has a very difficult time spending their 80, 70 years of life knowing that it has no aim. Whatever you do, it doesn't matter. You have no control over whatever happens to you, because you're just a bunch of molecules and cells, triggering each other and, making you do whatever behavior it is. So that is the type of control that, every debate is psychology. It's very difficult to process from a psychological point of view. And, as a scientist, that is, I can also add to that, which makes things even worse, that this is not something science can prove, right? We don't know. We know exactly what happens to the body, and we know how you go back into the cycle of carbon, and the cycle of nitrogen, and the cycle of this, and how, you become that little flower that is then going to be eaten by whatever. But we don't know if there is something called consciousness, if who you identify as a person, if that is, just a bunch of neurons triggering each other, or is there really something in there? Is there this, I don't know, universal network of consciousnesses that just manifest in? We don't know. And I'm not saying there is, but we can't say there isn't, because that's our limitations. That's where they end. And this is where science loses battles in creationism or against creationism, typically, when they start standing for an opinion that is, it's just not something a lot of people would stand for. It's not how I want to feel. This insignificant little speck in the universe that can just be wiped out tomorrow, right? Do we entertain thoughts on a daily basis that a burst of gamma rays can wipe out Earth as we know it, of all life forms, in a split second? No. Is it scientifically possible? There is actually a more than 50% chance that it's going to happen. But but can we live our life? Do we live our lives thinking, oh, is the gamma rays coming? Not that I'm going to know, because I'll die before I even figure it out that this was the gamma ray, right? I'll burn from the inside out. So this is what you have here. It's the human psyche protecting itself, because I may be right, or someone may be right, and they think that all we are insignificant piles of molecules that reproduce blindly. But do I want to live with that for 80 years? Hell no.
That's a very bleak outlook, at the same time very consoling to know that there's a 50% chance that we will be eradicated by a gamma ray. I did promise in the Facebook post leading up to this event to have one question answered, and I just want to bring it in before we get to the very last opportunity for the audience to ask a question. It's a very short one, but I think it's important to check. So the question is as follows: is a three-legged dog missing one leg at a disadvantage, biologically speaking or evolutionarily speaking?
Well, I mean, I guess an evolutionary biologist would probably, everybody would expect them to say, oh yeah, I mean, four-legged dogs run faster, walk better, they can catch prey. How's a three-legged dog going to get food? Da 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 da. But again, it sounds like I'm always going back to this, but it's always multiple things. It's never your genes. It's never your physical abilities, unless that's the physical abilities that don't allow you to stay alive. I mean, that would be a genetic restriction. But a three-legged dog, if you think about these, probably all of you have, like I have, these pop-up Facebook posts on shelter dogs, shelter cats, wonderful stories of the poor little monkey and finch and you name it, things that are saved. And then I think one of them is called the dodo. I mean, if you put that into a Western society, or you post it in the right place, then a dog who has a story of she's a survivor because she was beaten and one of her legs was broken and we had to cut it off, or she was born without a leg. She's genetically defaulted, right? Or dysfunctional. And all she wants is a loving home. You're going to get an owner for that dog faster than you are going to get one for a healthy dog, because of the pity we feel towards situations like this. And then what you're going to end up with when you measure the hard facts, when you took to matter of facts, is that this injured or this innately dysfunctional animal is going to have a longer lifespan and potentially an opportunity to reproduce because they just so happen to make it on the Facebook page where a lot of compassionate people are, and someone adopted them and gave them the best life. And then there you have another healthy dog that's going to live their life on the streets or the shelter because not enough people felt sorry for them, right? So it is always the context. And I think that the three-legged dog is especially interesting when a lot of us can relate to like applications and wherever those applications may be, you know, like this, there, or the other. But more and more, or like institutions and whatnot, they are interested in the story behind the metrics that they're receiving and behind the merits that they're receiving. And oftentimes you're going to see, and it's a very human, but also very, very relevant approach that from two candidates, whether it's a job or anything else, from two candidates who have equal merit, they're going to be more likely to choose those whose story touches them more. And it's not because of pity. It can be because someone there can relate more. It's because it touches a nerve with someone who's reading it. But it, you know, that you bring in this subjective evaluation of, now I'm not only interested in your CV and your previous experiences. You've passed that. Now I'm interested in whether I like you. Right? And it's the same thing we're talking about. And you know, like every job has a bunch of candidates. And sometimes someone doesn't get, so many times, someone doesn't get the position, not because they're not qualified, but because of subjective reasons. You know, it's the vibe, you know, do I relate to you as a person?
Mm-hmm. So we have time for one more question from the audience. And I would encourage the members of the audience present here to grab at this opportunity. If really no one is willing to come and meet this challenge, then there is wonderful. Shimon, please.
I mean, I would also have a question, but I see there is a question also in the chat, so I just don't want to take the chance away because it was sooner. So it is written there sooner. So
I mean, feel free to start with yours.
Yeah, so I was just curious, and I wanted to say kind of a completely different question from, if it's no problem, from. So it just refers back to an earlier part of this event, namely that where the discussion was more about genes and personal gene editing. So I just read some about for instance, gene editing and you know, there are you know, just because I think it was in the press lately, so about one could read about it often. So it's kind of new gene editing technologies like CRISPR, etc. And then I've often read that that, you know, it's like okay, a scientist saying in the press that okay, this is, I mean, this is quite good, but of course we should be very wary of these to a certain extent because we just really don't know the human genome or the interconnections inside the human genes so much. So we might just cause some troubles there. So and I was just thinking, so how complex is it really? So for instance, if we see the computational capabilities that we've reached, so is it really the state today that they just kind of cannot yet see how complex the human genome really is and how complex the interconnections are, so that we cannot say with precision that this action will not cause any very serious or grave complications?
Yeah, so I think one of the important things, there are two things to consider over here in terms of what do we know of the human genome. One, we tend to think that everything in the human genome is something that codes a protein that will be then expressed. The reality of it is that probably 10% of the human genome is what actually codes proteins. Everything else is there for regulatory reasons or non-coding sequences, you know, like just non-coding as in not having any regulatory function. And that means that we not only need to understand what the coding sequences code, we need to understand how the regulatory sequences regulate. And that is a whole different level of complexity, because whatever they code, that I only have to figure out once. If it codes insulin, if it codes this, if it codes that, I'm done. But regulation is a process. So for that, I need to know how those regulatory sequences work from conception to death. And that's a whole different story. So I can't just say, oh, this is what the regulatory sequence does. Yeah, at this life stage, under these circumstances, in this embryo, da 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 da. So that's one. The other one is, like I said, everything is going to be depending on the environment, right? What we are capable of expressing and what we actually express can be, you know, black and white based on what environmental stimuli we're getting, what types of developmental processes we undergo, what types of impacts we suffer during any stage of our development. It is all going to be dependent on that. And this is the part that we are unaware of. Because every, you know, there's very different, you can't put humans under experimental conditions for 80 years and stimulate them in a way to see what happens to them, right? So this is the difficulty of it.
All right, thank you, Orsi. So I'm just going to wrap up very quickly because we just got to 6:30 when this open lecture should end. So I just want to reiterate one more time that Jakobsleiter, this annual publication, is welcoming and accepting all submissions from high school students in any discipline, especially encouraging multidisciplinary approaches. And we are very much hoping that today's open lecture was a first step in generating ideas that could be further put into a proper research paper. And we are very much hoping that members of the audience who are in high school at present or just finished high school are going to submit their papers to us. As a second point, I just want to advertise to you that next week we are going to follow up this lecture with a second one. On a Friday, the 18th of June, we will be hosting Ádám Nádasdy for a similar open lecture. And 2 weeks from now, we will be hosting Csaba Play on a Wednesday, 23rd of June. These are all available. I mean, these pieces of information are all available on our Facebook page as well as on our online webpage for Jakobsleiter. And as a last point, and probably the most important that I want to make, is that I just want to thank Orsi for being available for us for this wonderful discussion. And I would also like to thank members of the audience for being with us and for raising these very interesting and important questions. Thank you all for coming today. And see you everybody next week on a Friday with Ádám Nádasdy.